What exactly are key performance indicators and how do they affect me as a data platform professional? Welcome to this video on analyzing business data with T-SQL. My name is Kevin Fiesel. I'm the proprietor of Galaxy Services LLC, a consulting firm which specializes in work all across the data platform space, especially SQL Server. This is the start of a brand new series on analyzing business data with T-SQL. The idea of this series is that I'm trying to split the gap between two very different groups of people: data platform professionals and software developers who write SQL either full-time or at least as part of their job, and business people who have an understanding of what relevant key performance indicators are, but they may not know how to implement them in their own databases. Thus, if I do it correctly, half of what I describe in this series will probably be boring and obvious to you, but the other half will be new and fresh and exciting. So let's see how I do. In the meantime, I believe we are going to need to head off to the classroom for a bit. Before I go too far, I should note that this video series is based on a talk that I've created. The title of this talk is Analyzing Business Data with T-SQL. I don't have any recordings of the full talk at this time, but if you're watching the videos in this series, you're going to get the same content but with 20% fewer filler words and awkward pauses. So you've got that going for you. By the end of this series of videos, I have a few goals I'd like to meet. First, I am going to introduce the concept of key performance indicators. After doing that, I will describe some common key performance indicators in the retail space. There's nothing particularly special about using retail KPIs versus KPIs in other industries, except that retail KPIs are very common and thus we tend to be intuitively familiar with many of them. Then I'll show you how to calculate these KPIs using T-SQL against an online transactional processing or OLTP system. I'm specifying OLTP systems here rather than the alternative of online analytical processing or OLAP systems. The entire purpose of an OLAP system is to generate business measurements like key performance indicators. So if you've designed your data warehouse correctly, calculating KPIs should be trivial enough that any business user can open up Excel, connect to your warehouse, and get results with a few mouse clicks. But that's kind of boring for demonstration, so I'm going for hard mode. We're going to do this all in a transactional processing system. Finally, I'll introduce some great analytic functionality in T-SQL. For almost every KPI that I introduce, I will also introduce some analytical capability in T-SQL. Some of it will be a bit trivial, some of it much less so. But my goal is to have some fun with the language along the way. With that in mind, let's get started. In this video, we are going to stay here in the classroom and not have any sort of demonstration. But the next several videos will be very demo heavy to make up for this. I just need to make sure that you have the foundation of what a KPI is, as I'm going to assume much of this knowledge for the rest of the series. With that in mind, let's dig into the first concept. What is a key performance indicator? A key performance indicator, or KPI for short, is a performance measurement of how well an organization is doing at achieving a specific goal. There's a fair amount to unpack here, and the way I'll explain it is to describe the attributes of a normal KPI. The first attribute of a typical KPI is that it is a numeric measurement. We need to be able to quantify the thing. Red, yellow, and green are not quantitative measurements. They may be useful qualitatively as some indicator of bad, okay, and good, but that's not going to be sufficient for a KPI. In addition to being something we can quantify, a KPI must tie to an explicit organizational goal. In other words, the amount of food employees purchase from the in-building cafeteria is something we can measure, but it probably will not be a KPI, not unless the organization has a particular reason to track and operate on this information. There needs to be an explicit justification for why some swath of the organization cares about a value for it to be a proper KPI. Perhaps we're tracking how often people eat in versus eat out, with the goal being to squeeze more working hours from the salaried employees by incentivizing them to stay in the building and cut down on those lunchtime commutes. Associated with this value, we also need to have a goal. We need to be able to identify whether the organization is meeting its goal. If tracking cafeteria purchases is our measurement, We need to have a way of identifying if employees are eating enough food there versus going outside. To do that, we could track the number of employees who buy food in the cafeteria, as well as the dollar amounts these employees spend. We could set a company goal for these two measurements. Measurement goals tie in closely with the next concept. We need a target. We want some minimum or maximum threshold for identifying success. Let's say that we want 3,000 employees to eat at the cafeteria on a daily basis, spending in total at least $35,000 on food on a daily basis. In this case, we have two minima. If 4,000 employees eat there instead of 3,000, we're still meeting the threshold, and we're pretty happy about that. But if only 2,500 people eat there, we're below that cutoff and have not met our goal. Finally, each KPI has a specific grain. The concept of a grain is familiar to data warehousing practitioners, but it may not be to OLAP developers or to business users, so let me explain. We have this notion of facts in data warehousing. For now, let's think of a fact as a measurement. It's some quantitative valuation of an event that occurred. We store facts in a fact table. The grain of that fact table is the maximum level of specificity for any fact in that table. Typically, we define grain in terms of dimensions, that is, explanatory information that provides relevant context to the fact. Let me give you an example of how all of this works. Going back to our cafeteria scenario, the relevant fact is that an order of food happens at the in-office cafeteria. We have a few measurements we could take of that event. First, that an event happened. We had one purchase. Next, when that event happened, a specific date and time. We may collect the count of items that the employee purchased and even the total dollar amount that the employee spent. But when we talk about grain, we can already hear some of the explanatory information. Who was that employee? Well, we could tie back a purchase to a specific employee based on their badge number or some other identifier and learn more about the person. What date was it? We might track the day of the week of the month, if it's a holiday, and so on. Which items did the person purchase? We could track that by stock keeping unit, commonly referred to as a SKU. That could link back to information about the specific product. Maybe we care about which cashier checked the person out, in which case we could have information about that cashier. Now the grain of our cafeteria purchase facts table is the employee, the cashier, the purchase event or order, the date, and the product. We would have one record for each product in the order. Now you might be wondering, why do we care so much about the grain of our fact? Well, the simple reason is, once we know the grain of our measure, we know we can't dig any deeper without making potentially scary assumptions. What I mean by this is, let's say that we only collect the date of the checkout, but not the time. If that's all I have in the database, and a business executive wants to know which are the busiest hours of the day for buying food from the cafeteria, I don't actually have enough information to answer that question. Instead, if I wanted to come up with an answer, I'd need to find some way to allocate data from a coarser grain to a finer grain. I might, for example, start with the intuition that, well, most people have lunch between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. Let's say that we have a separate survey indicating that 80% of employees eat lunch between those hours. Now, I could decide that 80% of the purchases have to happen within this block of time, and I can label after the fact which ones I've decided happened during that time frame. But that's kind of weird to think about, and I'm sure you can come up with ways in which the allocation process can fail. These allocation processes are synthetic or artificial. We can't actually tell which events happened during the 11 to 2 hours, and we don't even have enough information to know if our allocation rule is correct. We're simply assuming it to be the case. All that said, the opposite approach is typically just fine. We can usually aggregate results and move from one grain to a coarser grain. If I have the number of purchases and the total dollar amount of purchases by employee and cashier, I can sum up the number of purchases by cashier across all employees, seeing how much throughput each cashier is doing. But what about dimensions we didn't specify at the time of the event? For example, let's say that we want to know not only which cashier checked a person out, but at which register the cashier did it. If we didn't collect register information for events, we cannot later aggregate this data by register. We just don't have the appropriate link to do so. Unless, of course, there's a mapping function. If we know a way to map a cashier to a specific register, we can do this. Maybe we have some other source system that indicates when a specific cashier logs into a specific register, and there's just a general rule that this cashier always logs into this particular register. You could have multiple cashiers sharing a register because maybe they work different shifts, but for whatever reason, the cashier never goes to another register. If you want to add that complexity, we would incorporate date as well and say on this day, this cashier signed into this register. So it all works out, but I didn't want to add too many lines on the image. In any event, we can bring in the information of cashier logged in to register. From there, we could backfill existing data and expand the grain of this fact table to include that register. From here on out, we can also collect the register at the time of sale, permanently expanding our fact, or we can have a process run after the fact to fix mixing data, but that's not a good answer. Either way, this is the key method in which we can aggregate facts across a dimension that we lacked at the start. I've spoken a few times about aggregation here, and now I want to introduce another key term that is popular in the data warehousing space: additivity. Additivity is important because technically I can aggregate any set of numbers. The problem is, however, that some aggregations do not make business sense or even mathematical sense. Whether these particular aggregations make sense will depend upon additivity. There are 3 levels we tend to consider in warehousing. The first is the simplest and best for us. A particular measure is additive. In other words, we can sum up data rows for this measure across any dimension without a problem. In our example, the dollar amount employees spend is additive. I can sum up the total dollars spent and that works. The sum of dollars spent by product is a valid calculation and it lets us know which products provide the highest amounts of revenue. The sum of dollars by employee gives us an idea of who's spending money at the cafeteria, and so on. Additive measures are easy, and the good news is, if you design your system well, most of your measures will be additive. The opposite side of the coin is non-additive measures. For these, we cannot sum up rows across any dimension. Typically, these are percentages or ratios. Let's say that 18% of our employees bought lunch in the cafeteria today, and 27% bought lunch in the cafeteria a week ago on the same day. We cannot aggregate these numbers in any meaningful way. I cannot just sum them up and say, hey, 45% of employees bought their lunch either today or a week ago, because, well, there are probably a lot of repeat employees in here. I cannot say that an average of 22.5% of employees bought lunch over the past 2 Mondays because employee counts can change in between. I also cannot answer the question of what percentage of employees checked out at Register 3 or with Cashier Betty, as our percentages tie to the date alone. Business users may want to see percentages and ratios to simplify the logic necessary to do their jobs, but these percentages and ratios are locked into the specific grain. For that reason, it is better to store the underlying measures and perform these calculations dynamically once you've narrowed down to the correct grain. The in-between level here is semi-additive measures. These are measures we can sum up across certain dimensions, but not all of them. For example, a bank account balance is semi-additive. The bank can look at its ledger and say, Alice has $100 in her account today, Bob has $200 in his account, Charlie has $50 in his account, and Diane has $250 in her account. The bank has a total of $600 in liabilities around customer deposits on this date. That is a valid aggregation. But if Bob looks at his account balances, he might say that he has $200 in the bank today, he had $200 yesterday, and he had $200 the day before. If he goes to the bank and tries to withdraw $600, the bank won't let him, because that's not a valid aggregation. Bank account balance, therefore, is additive across all customers for a given date, but it is non-additive across dates. I've thrown around a lot of terminology here, and the lines between terms may still feel a little bit blurry, so let me summarize things a bit as we wrap up this video. A fact is a record in a dataset. This record will tell us about some event that either has occurred, is occurring, or will occur. A measure is the numeric computation or explanation about the fact. A key performance indicator is a measure that ties back to a specific business need. In other words, our fact is that employee Tony purchased 1 block of instant noodles and 1 can of RC Cola from the cafeteria on September 9th, 2024 at 11:35 a.m. He paid 35 cents for the noodles and 75 cents for the pop. He checked out at register 2 and cashier Janice sold him these items. As a quick note, this technically is 2 separate fact records, as each product would represent a slightly different event under the umbrella of a single order, which may be its own separate fact. Measures are the numeric computations or explanations of the fact. Tony spent $1.10 in total. Tony purchased 2 items. Janice checked out 45 employees in the 11 a.m. hour on September 9th of 2024. We sold 196 bricks of instant noodles on September 9th of 2024. Key performance indicators are numeric measurements tied to an organizational goal with some target and grain. We want to sell 150 bricks of instant noodles on a daily basis. We want each cashier to check out at least 50 employees during the 11 a.m. hour. We want the average amount that an employee pays for lunch to be at least $6. Those are ideas of KPIs. Hopefully that clears up the difference between facts, measures, and key performance indicators. That was our extended classroom session on business metrics. I know that I stayed pretty high level in terms of concept, but it is important to have some of this foundation for when we dig into different business calculations over the rest of the series. And I did not want to assume that everybody watching this video already understands some of these principles behind data warehousing. In the next video, I will introduce you to one category of key performance indicator, financial KPIs. We'll have links and show notes in the description below. And until we see each other in the next video, take care.